Sermons that are boring tend to have two things in common. They begin badly and they end badly. I've already talked about how to start a sermon, so this time I want to talk about how to end a sermon. It's hard to end a sermon. How do you wrap it all up after you've made your main points? Some preachers don't know how to end, and so they just sit down. It's not a good way to end. Some preachers end by saying, "Let us pray." I've done that myself. Sometimes I haven't known how to end the sermon, and so I just simply lead the congregation in prayer, hoping that my prayer will wrap it all up. Some preachers end by asking a question, such as, "What does God want you to do today?" Or, "What is God saying to you?" Or, "Who do you need to forgive this week?" Some preachers end their sermons by having a familiar quotation or a poem. Now, these are not bad endings necessarily. In fact, sometimes they can be appropriate. It can be appropriate to end with a prayer or with a quotation or a poem or a question. But generally, these are weak endings, and we can do better in drawing in the congregation and sending them out to live out the good news. A strong ending might have a story at the end. Just as a story makes a great beginning to a sermon, a story can make a great ending to a sermon. You use a story at the beginning in order to set up the topic and to set up the question or the dilemma of the sermon. And so putting a story at the end of the sermon is a way of illustrating your answer or the claim of your sermon. It's not enough to just simply give your claim in an abstract way. It needs to be made concrete. It needs to be enfleshed. It needs to have an illustration. If we can't envision it, we can't enact it. And so having a story at the end that illustrates the claim of your sermon is a powerful way of ending the sermon. Now, sometimes you can't find a suitable story for the end of the sermon. And so at least see if you can't find an image from the beginning of the sermon or an idea at the beginning of the sermon and put that also at the end. Come back to that. That's a nice way to wrap up the sermon. Another strong way to end the sermon is by having a charge to the congregation. A charge is a statement that encourages or challenges or invites the congregation to take some sort of action. Jesus does this at the end of the parable of the Good Samaritan. A lawyer comes up to him and asks him, "Who is my neighbor?" That's the question. That's the dilemma that needs to be solved. Jesus then responds by telling the parable of the Good Samaritan. That's the exploration of the question. Then Jesus asks the lawyer, "Who was neighbor to the man who was wounded?" And the lawyer answers by saying, "The Samaritan." Well, that's the answer. That's the claim in the sermon. And then Jesus says, "Go and do likewise." That is the charge. So this is a very powerful structure for a sermon. A question, a quest, a claim, and a charge. Now there is one drawback, though, to ending with a charge. And that is that a charge can sometimes feel like a burden to the congregation. Sometimes the charge, really, when you boil it down, is really saying nothing more than, "Go out there and just try harder." That's not the good news. And so let me suggest one more powerful way to end the sermon. End with celebration. Once your sermon has arrived at its answer or its claim, celebrate that claim. Laugh and dance and sing that claim. Imagine all the ways that that claim helped to transform the world. Send out the congregation, not so much with a charge, as with an empowerment based on joy and hope. Now that's good news. This is Ryan Algrim joining you in your commitment to preach no more boring sermons.